Hello everyone, and welcome to our Maundy Thursday service. It's the last night that Jesus would spend with his disciples. And out of all his teachings, there was one lesson, one that he wanted them to not only remember, but to actually practice, to live. And it was the lesson to love one another, but it wasn't just any kind of love, it was a particular kind of love. He said, I want you to learn how to love one another the way that I love you. So much of the time we think of love and loving as being nice to people. No, Jesus would say that's really not the kind of love I'm talking about. The text tonight describes Jesus and his students as they sit around a dinner table, celebrating an annual traditional meal. They did this every year. But this dinner would be one that they would never forget. A reading from John chapter 13. It was just before the Passover festival, and Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. And having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal and took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist. And after that he poured water into a basin. And he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And he came to Simon Peter and Simon said, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. No, Peter said, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, Unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Then, Lord, Simon Peter replied, Not just my feet, but also my hands and my head as well. Jesus answered, Those who have had a bath need only wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. You are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that's why he said, Not everyone was clean. And when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I've done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set an example that you should do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Maundy Thursday. Maundy means the mandate. That's what the original word from the Latin. Maundy means, well, it's Latin for command. So it's like the last commandment, the last mandate, the last commission, the last thing I want to tell you all that's important. Of course, this happened the night before Jesus died. So this is the last time he will be with his disciples in any sort of teaching capacity. They've been with him for 3 years now. And this is their final meal together. They are celebrating Passover, as was their custom. They're gathered together, and they're going to remember this night because it's really the last time that they all gather together as a group. They're going to remember that this is the last meal and what he said, because that's what you tend to do. You know, when it's your last time with someone, and not necessarily even if they're dying, but if you know that if you're saying goodbye to someone, or or if someone dies, you usually remember certain things that they say to you, don't you? You remember things. And so I think this will be a night that's etched in the memories of the disciples as they're sitting around together and they're having this meal. Jesus did something most unusual. The text tells us that he stood up, he took off his outer garment, he put a towel around his waist, and he knelt down and he began to wash their feet. Now, for us, that's very strange. The feet washing part isn't the strange thing in this text, because this was a common, everyday thing that happened. Like us, if you go into someone's house, you'll say things like, take your coat off, sit down, would you like a cup of tea? Well, basic hospitality, right? Nothing unusual about that for us. There's nothing unusual at all about someone coming into a home and getting their feet washed in Jesus' day. That was a common, everyday practice. What was unusual, startling, shocking, was that the teacher, the rabbi, the teacher, the important one, would do that. So that's what makes all the disciples uncomfortable when he takes this position of the servant, really, and starts to go around the table and wash and dry their feet. Nobody really understood what in the world he was doing. That's just pretty common. But you'll notice in verse 12, he said, do you understand what I'm doing? Do you understand what I've just done? Well, no, they didn't. Not really. Not really. Not on Thursday. Because they had just been arguing about who was the best leader among them, who had the best ideas, how should they go forward. They were arguing about who was the greatest. That's the phrase. They were arguing among themselves about who's the greatest. But I take that to mean they're arguing about opinions on what to do next and what's the best idea. And now that Jesus is in Jerusalem, they don't know he's going to die tomorrow. But so they're still sort of arguing about position and authority and how they should move forward and what they should do. And it's in that context that Jesus very quietly just stands up, takes the towel and starts to wash their feet. It's like a visual lesson. Because at this point, the disciples are still in competition with each other. They're still arguing with each other. There's a lot of one-upmanship. And by this action, he's questioning the whole way that they behave toward one another. And he gives them this mandate. And the mandate is to love one another as I have loved you, he says to the disciples. That's the final thing he says. Love one another as I have loved you. Now, what is fascinating about this is that love one another is not new at all. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus and his disciples walked on the earth, the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament speaks about the importance of loving one another. So there's really nothing unusual, there's nothing new. If you were to say to these disciples, yeah, it's important that you love one another, they would say, yeah, of course it is. Yeah, it's part of our faith tradition. It's part of what we believe God has called us to do, is to love one another. So when Jesus gave the final mandate or the final command and he said, love one another, that's not the part that is new to them. The part that's new, and might be new for us too, is when he said, I want you to learn how to love one another. And it's this last part of the text, as I have loved you. So it's a very particular kind of love. And it shows itself in a very particular way. So he says, I want you to love one another as I have loved you.
Now, generally, when we think about love, we think about being fond of someone, you know, or we think of liking someone very much. When we think about, when you say, I love someone, I love my children, that's a particular kind of love. I love my wife, I love my husband. That's a particular kind of love. I love my friends. This kind of love, by the way, we really, for the most part, don't have to be taught this, in the sense that if you like someone a lot, you're going to be good to them, right? If you really care for someone, you're going to want to look after them and do what's good for them. If you have a good friend, you want to stand by your good friend. Why? Because you like them, you love them. Fair enough. That's not the kind of love that Jesus is talking about, right? It's good, it's necessary, there's nothing wrong with it, but that's not really the type of love that Jesus is talking about, because you don't really need to learn that. That sort of comes naturally to us. We love people that we really like, and we're good to people that are good to us. Nothing unusual about that, but that's not what he says. He says, I want you to learn how to love as I have loved you. So he goes on to say, now do you understand what I just said? You call me teacher and Lord, and I am, and I just knelt down and I washed your feet. Kind of shocking, isn't it? You weren't expecting me to do that, were you, disciples? Like, no, we weren't expecting that. A little bit unconventional, isn't it, disciples? They'd say, yeah, very uncomfortable. It was awful. Jesus, by his action, just by actually doing something like that, he's saying, this is kind of what love looks like. Love is doing what needs to be done at the time it needs to be done. He's showing us a willingness to do something for another that you might not normally do. It's showing us, it's like learning how to say something or do something that doesn't necessarily come naturally to you. Maybe you wouldn't even think about it. Love in action. When Jesus is washing the disciples' feet, it's an action it's sacrificial, it's needful, it's purposeful. Is it unconventional? Yes, it was. Was it inconvenient? Possibly. Was it uncomfortable? Yeah, definitely for those that were receiving it. But it's a higher purpose. It's a higher kind of love. He's showing them, you're all concerned, disciples, about loving when it's convenient for you and when you want to do it. This is a different way. This is a different way. Do you understand what I just did? I washed your feet. It's an example, just an example. And he's saying sometimes the most loving thing to do could be very conventional. You have to discern it. You have to figure out where you are in life, what's going on, and the people that you're with, whether it's at work or whether it's at home, wherever you are. What does love look like in the challenge that you find yourself in today? Sometimes it might look like shocking people by your response. Sometimes it might look like doing something that you normally would never consider doing, but you think, at this point in time, I think I need to do that. Sometimes love might look like you're not following the crowds and you're not doing what everyone else does. See, just in the action of Jesus washing the disciples' feet, he stepped right outside of what would be normally expected to show them what love looks like. It's like, guys, you got to be a lot more creative in how you love. You got to be a lot more creative. Every situation you're in, every challenge, every person, every work situation, every family situation, it has to be assessed. There's no one size fits all. You need to stand back and say, okay, well, what needs done here? So for Jesus, he's with a group of men who are competing with one another. and they all want to be the boss, and they all think they have the best ideas. So there's a lot of jockeying for position. They want to be successful, they want to be competitive. What does he do? He takes the towel and kneels down and washes their feet. It's the last thing the men would want. And Jesus is saying, yeah, well, it might be the last thing that you want, but this is what you need, guys. This is what you need. You need to learn how to be a servant to one another. And just by me doing this, I'm showing you what love looks like. You're on the wrong track, which means that love can correct. Love doesn't just go along to get along. So often, we've heard this from the very beginning. In our spiritual lives, in the scripture, we've heard this call to love. It's just like a basic foundational piece of our faith that we're learning how to love. But what can happen is it can be reduced to, it means just be nice. And that's absolutely not what Jesus is modeling at all. It's very easy for us to think that following Christ and being a loving person simply means that I have to be nice to everyone. And that's absolutely not what love is. It's really got very little to do with niceness when you consider it. Love one another as I have loved you is about, I suppose it's like stepping up to the plate and doing what needs to be done for the situation that you're called into. That's what love looks like. What is truly needed here? What is truly needed? I mean, I think that might be actually a good question as we discern what love looks like in the situation that we find ourselves in tonight. Because we're all in different places. We all have different challenges. And we all have different situations where we would think, yes, I think that God is calling me to love in this particular area. So the next question would be, okay, then what does that love look like? For Jesus, he would say, you need to find out what's truly needed. What would be truly helpful? Not just a reaction. First reactions are often not helpful. First reactions are often not helpful. When you're discerning what love looks like in a relationship with someone or how to handle a conflict or a problem, the first reactions we have are not necessarily the correct leading at all. It's almost like we have to stand back and we have to think to ourselves, I suppose you could pray. Actually, this is what prayer is: stopping, waiting, getting some discernment. What is the most helpful thing here for me to say or do? What's the most helpful thing? And then make the move. Now, for Jesus, on that particular night, in that particular culture, with this group of men who were in competition with each other, that was the most helpful thing to do. That's what love looked like that night for these men. They're bickering, they're competitive, they all want to lead. And right at the beginning, when Jesus is kneeling down, by modeling, he's saying, you men are on the wrong track. And you're never going to get where I want you to go if you stay on the track that you're on. You're off track. And so he washes their feet. So I think one of the ways to get a handle on this, when he says, love one another as I have loved you, I think one of the ways that we can get a handle on what does love look like in the workplace? What does love look like guiding children or grandchildren, or helping friends, or in our marriages, with our partners? What does love look like when I am in conflict with someone? I think we have to ask ourselves, what is the most beneficial, life-giving thing that I can do here? And then be open to what comes, because it might be something that you've never done before. It might be something that you've never tried before, or maybe you're not to do anything at all, right? Sometimes love looks like keeping quiet and not interfering, which can be extremely difficult if you're the type that wants to move ahead and get things done quickly, right? If the Spirit is whispering in the still, quiet voice, just stay back. Don't interfere. That could well be what love looks like. See, the difficulty with Jesus' teaching is, all of them, is that there's no one size fits all. It's not like I could say to you tonight, okay, Jesus' last command is love one another as I have loved you, and here's how you do it. It doesn't work that way at all. It seems to me that it's more about learning how to assess every situation that we find ourselves in, and then listening to the leading of God. And by the way, this also applies to not just loving other people, this also applies to loving yourself. There's 3 components to love, remember? It was learn how to love others, learn how to love yourself, and that's what loving God looks like. You get the first 2, that's what loving God looks like. So it isn't a case of one size fits all. It's more a case of, okay, what is the most helpful, beneficial, healing thing to say or do or not that would help this situation? And you might get a weight, which would be don't do anything. So I want to encourage you with that this Maundy Thursday, not just to love, because we know how to do that with the ones we like, but a bigger challenge is love one another as I have loved you, as Jesus would love, as Jesus does love. Something to ponder as we move into Good Friday tomorrow, and then on into the rest of the weekend. Amen.
You have my heart, and I'm yours forever. You are my strength, God of grace and power, and everything you hold in your hands. Still you take time for me. Can't understand. Praise you, God of earth and sky. How beautiful is your unfailing love. you.